Hey there, I'm Alex Kidman, and this is the Oppo A60 5G. Let's get into the review. So, over the years here in Australia, Oppo's bread and butter really has been affordable phones. Mostly budget phones, a few mid-ranges, and then a handful of interesting flagships. The A60 5G fits into Oppo's A series, which means it is a budget phone. Here in Australia, it'll run you $299, putting it a little bit under the price of the Oppo A80 I recently reviewed. And typically, as you slide down those kinds of price scales, you see more and more compromises creep into a phone. The A60 5G, though, is a really interesting phone in that respect because there's a few features on here that you really wouldn't expect to see in a phone at this price point, and a few other compromises that are not that shocking. I should point out at the start that the Oppo A60 5G is quite a different phone to the Oppo A60. That phone has a different RAM configuration, different processor, different battery, it's a little bit cheaper, and of course it is not 5G. I have not tested the Oppo A60, I have only tested the Oppo A60 5G, just to be clear. So the Oppo A60 5G is built around a 6.67-inch 120Hz capable LCD display, 720p effective resolution. Not super sharp then, but pretty much what you expect at this kind of price point. 1080p still sits as a nice to have at these kinds of prices. And the display itself is reasonably nice. Hole punch up the top for the selfie camera. If you're particularly fussed about bezels, you may find this one a little problematic. The bezels are noticeable, especially down towards the bottom. Doesn't fuss me, but I know it does fuss some people. In terms of colours, Oppo sells the A60 5G in either Nebula Red or Ocean Blue. No prizes for guessing what I'm holding right now. That's right, it's not the Nebula Red. And look, notably, I have said in the past, I do rather like blue phones, and yeah, this is a nice looking blue phone. Some may find the kind of wave pattern on the back maybe a little too blingy for their tastes. I could see where they were coming from if that was their opinion, but I like it well enough. That is, of course, 100% subjective, but those are your colour choices. Interesting that there is not a black variant, because black is kind of, well, it's the black of phones. Nearly every phone has a black variant. This one doesn't. In terms of controls, it's all about as standard as you can possibly get, with standard volume controls sitting above a combination fingerprint reader and power button. At the base, you've got USB-C for data and power, next to a 3.5mm headphone jack, still nice to see. And then on the left-hand side, you've got a combination nano SIM and micro SD card slot. Nice to see storage expansion here because it is seemingly vanishing from a lot of phones these days, even in the budget space. Speaking of the fingerprint reader, I've had really no issues with using it during my review period. This is not a super fast phone, so the unlocking is not super fast as you might expect, but I've not really had problems with it failing to detect what I was doing. The Oppo A60 sells itself really strongly on the fact that it has military standard shock protection as well as a degree of water resistance. Specifically, it's IP54, although you've got to dig into the specs really to find that out. IP54 is not the highest you can get, of course, but at the $299 price point, I still see so many phones that just say, oh, I'm water repellent, which really doesn't mean anything. The Oppo A60 5G should at least be able to survive showers of rain, that kind of thing. Don't go swimming with it. Now, to be clear, I've not tested this to the point of destruction. I have a whole video around why I think most of the YouTube tests that purport to show that are actually just destruction porn, so go watch that at your leisure. But the nice story here is that this is a phone that should survive a fair degree longer than many others in its price point. Now, me being me, of course, I'm going to advocate that you put a case on it. Somewhat annoyingly, there isn't one in the box. And I say annoyingly because Oppo always used to provide cases in the box with many of its phones, and it just hasn't done that for this particular handset. But I would still say, good plan to maximize its protection with a case as well. On the camera front, look, the biggest way that you can tell that you're using a budget phone is by looking at the cameras, because this is the #1 spot where manufacturers will cut costs by lowering camera quality. Those are the parts that do cost a fair bit of money. And around the back here, you can see two lenses. You're really only actually going to shoot with one of them, the 50-megapixel wide lens there. The other one is a focusing lens. And then in the hole punch at the front, you've got a fairly standard but fairly basic 5-megapixel selfie lens. And I was not expecting huge things out of the Oppo A60 5G in camera terms, and I pretty much didn't get them. I mean, in regular daylight, it shoots fine, it's okay without being exceptional, but if you push it particularly far with low light, for example, it falls over pretty quickly. You don't get any actual optical zoom, of course. You wouldn't really see it at this price point still. But you do get digital cropping at 2 times as per Oppo's standard camera app, and then up to 10 times, although you really shouldn't shoot at 10 times. And look, I'll demonstrate this. So I was out at a race course for completely non-race related reasons, and so I was a little bored, and I thought, well, I'll test out the A65G's zoom. So here's a standard shot of the race course with its wide lens, and that all looks okay. This is not an artistically stunning photo. That's not the point. And then here's the same shot at 2 times, which, again, is okay, gets you a little bit close to the action. But if I really want to zoom in on that sign, do I go to 10 times? Well, I can, but I shouldn't, because that's really not a good or particularly compelling shot. The front-facing selfie camera does okay work. I mean, here's me, and it's all right. It's a little bit slow, I will say that, and it does have Oppo's inbuilt beauty features, which you really can push a little too far in terms of smoothing and changing eye shape and stuff like that. I don't like the results it gives me, but other people might find them fine. Video is reasonable for a phone of this style. Look, honestly, this is not a camera phone, but very few $299 phones are camera phones in that sense. If you want really good camera quality, you are still going to have to spend a little bit more, but within its price bracket, it's acceptable but not exceptional. The model of the Oppo A65G as sold in Australia ships with a MediaTek Dimensity 6300 processor, 4GB of RAM and 128GB of storage. Now, you can expand the storage via microSD, and you can expand the RAM, because I'm sure someone's going to point this out. It'll take up to 4GB of virtual RAM. That's not the same thing. This is something that a lot of manufacturers will now do. They'll say that it's got double the RAM that it really does, while putting in the small print, actually, this is virtual RAM. Virtual RAM does not get addressed in quite the same way as actual RAM in terms of improving the performance of the phone. But what of that MediaTek Dimensity 6300? Well, to test that, I first ran it through some standard benchmarks, such as Geekbench 6's CPU test, against a range of phones at similar price points here in Australia at the time of producing this video. Here's how it compared. Now, it'd be really interesting to see how the regular Oppo A60, the non-5G variant, compares, because that's running off a Qualcomm processor, but I've not yet been able to test that. The A65G is not entirely unusual in performance at this price point, but as you can see, it's not exactly exceptional either. It does fare a little bit better in GPU terms using 3D Mark's Slingshot and Wildlife tests. Here's how it compares against those same phones there. But the end result is a phone that's not particularly fast. Now, for day-to-day app usage, this thing's okay. Now, if you want to run more heavy-duty apps there, you're going to face a certain quantity of lag, especially when switching between applications. The Oppo A60 5G is an Android 14 phone, built around, of course, Oppo's own ColorOS launcher. It's not to my personal taste, but I do know people who do rather like its rather brighter appeal. It's definitely quite the rewrite of Android, and some people get very used to that and very comfortable with that if you're a long-term Oppo fan. Yep, this has got ColorOS, and you'll probably have a great time with it. At the time of producing this video, it's not entirely clear to me how many Android updates the A65G is going to have. I have put a request through to Oppo to clarify that, and when and if I find that out, I will add that to the description below. What they do promise, though, is for up to 36 months of fluency, which is to say, as per Oppo, that after 3 years, it should still have the same essential performance that it had on day one. Now, that's a nice promise to have. It's nice to think, okay, 3 years on, this will still be running at least as well as it used to. Although, of course, in this case, at least as well as it used to is not super fast. You really do have to keep that in mind. Something else that you have to keep in mind is that Oppo installs a lot of other apps here. Something like 13 additional games and a bunch of other apps. Of course, Booking.com is here because that thing infests every Android phone these days. And I kind of wish they wouldn't do this kind of thing. I know why it happens. Money changes hands. Thankfully, of course, you can just uninstall them as you wish. Oppo also installs its own apps on the Oppo A65G, as well as its own app market. So that's its own version of an app store, though you can still access Google Play. And I'm a little torn here. I like having competition. I think competition in the app marketplace is a really good idea. I just wish that this one was better curated. As an example, just kind of flicking through App Marketplace and looking at its editor's choice for games. One of them is a sportswear buying app. Another is for buying cryptocurrencies. These are not games. Who's editing this stuff? This is not good. Oppo, you should do better if you're going to have your own app marketplace in presenting that to audiences, in making it clear, hey, this is what I actually want to do. I can trust this more than I trust Google Play. And don't get me wrong, Google Play has had its problems with dodgy and fake apps. But when you present like this, Oppo, you're not making me think that App Market is any better. You're making me think it's worse. The Oppo A60 5G is, as the name suggests, a 5G phone, just sub 6 GHz here in Australia. Wouldn't expect anything else from a $299 phone, and I hit my typical kind of speed ranges, generally around 200 to 300 meg here in Sydney, testing on the Telstra network. Obviously, your ability to access 5G networks and then the speeds you get out of them will vary by area, but this is perfectly suitable to task, and if you were looking for a bit of a bump upgrade phone as 3G cuts the cord here in Australia, yes, this would do just fine. On the battery front, the Oppo A60 5G slightly bucks the trend of 5,000 mAh Android phones by having a 5,100 mAh battery instead. Not a huge bump up, but I was curious to see whether or not that would actually make any difference, because the values that manufacturers state are often typical values. Production can mean that they vary a little from those numbers. And of course, then there's the question of actually how efficient is the processor, how well does the screen handle matters, and that is all variable depending on the apps you run. So my standard way to test this is with a 1 hour 1080p YouTube video. Of course, the Oppo A60 5G will only handle that at 720p, but I do what I must. And I run that test for an hour from a fully charged phone, maximum brightness, moderate volume, to see whether or not it can last to at least 90%. Phones that fall below that tend to not last the day for most users, and then just to see how it compares against other phones. So here's how the A60 5G compares against that same crop of similarly priced phones. So it's not world-beating there, but it's not far off the pace, and it's certainly comfortably above that 90% barrier. I think most people will not have a problem with this lasting for a full day. I have recently also started running that test for 3 hours just to get a broader battery rundown picture. Now, I don't have comparative figures for other budget phones, and it would be unfair to compare this against, $1,000, $2,000 phones where I do have battery life figures. But here's how it managed its runtime across those 3 hours with that YouTube battery test. And that's a nice standard, consistent rundown. And really, in my day-to-day testing, this has been fine for an all-day battery life. If you were a very light user, you'd get into your second day, but then you would need to recharge it. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because the Oppo A60 5G does support Oppo's Super VOOC fast charging technology, up to 45 watts. Nice and rapid, great. But you're pretty much going to have to be an existing Oppo owner or be happy to cough up for a Super VOOC charger, because there is not one in the box at all. So should you buy the Oppo A60 5G? Well, look, every budget phone involves some level of compromises, but the good budget phones should balance some really nice, compelling features for their price point, suitable to their price point, against those compromises. And here for the A60 5G, I feel like that's the robustness of the phone above all else. The fact that it does have that extra layer of hardness in the glass, of water protection, not waterproofing, because that actually doesn't happen with phones. I really should make a video about that one day. But the fact is, this should be a tougher phone than many of the phones that you can buy at this price point. And I think that's its big competitive advantage. The cameras are fair for their price point without being exceptional. The performance could do with being a little bit punchier, and my understanding is there is also a 6 gig RAM, like 6 gig true RAM version of this phone in some markets, but that's not what we're seeing here in Australia. That might be an interesting bump up if it's available to you. And ultimately, if you're after a stylish looking and robust phone, this could be a good option at its $299 price point. But if your budget can stretch a little higher, you should consider other options, things like the Oppo A80, which I've seen very close to the price of this locally now, or phones like the Motorola Moto G85. And that's my take on the Oppo A60 5G. Thanks for watching all the way through to the end. If you've got any comments, please leave them below. I will do my best to answer queries as much as I can. And as always, I will encourage you to hit subscribe if you've enjoyed this, share it, like it, and have a great day.